This lecture is about who is a merchant. Now, the question of who is a merchant comes up 12 times in the UCC. As you know, the UCC applies to transactions in goods, and the people who are transacting don't need to be merchants any place in the UCC except these 12 code sections that I'm going to show you on the board. 4 of those are tested, 8 of them are not. The 4 which are tested are here. These sections, 2-201, subsection 2. We'll go through these more carefully. These are the 4 that are tested. And the 8 references to merchants in the UCC, which are not on the California bar exam, are these. We'll talk briefly about each of them so you'll understand them even though they're not tested. So we begin our discussion of who is a merchant with the UCC definition. 2-104 subsection 1 defines merchant. Now this subsection, this 2-104 section of the UCC actually has 3 things in it. One of them defines merchants, which we're going to go through. One of them defines the financing agency. And what do you mean by financing agency? And a financing agency is anyone who comes in between the buyer and the seller, and they provide the money so that maybe the buyer doesn't have to pay right now. They pay later. Those financing agencies are in subsection 2. We don't care about that. Subsection 3 defines what is meant by between merchants. And what's meant by between merchants is just that both parties are merchants. So the one we care about here is 2-104 subsection 1 because it defines merchants and it tells us that there are 3 ways to be a merchant. First, second, and third. The first way to be a merchant is to be one who deals in goods of the kind. Deals means that you buy and sell or you manufacture and sell. Okay, if you just buy, you don't deal in those goods. For example, General Motors. Let's suppose that General Motors buys their paint from someone. Okay. They buy a lot of paint if they buy it, but General Motors does not deal in paint. So just because they buy a lot doesn't make them a dealer. You got to buy and sell, or you got to manufacture it and sell. Now, one who deals in goods of the kind, and what we mean by goods of the kind, one who deals in goods of the kind, there was a question on the bar exam where there was this company that had business relationships with one of the parties already, and they sold paper to this person, toilet paper I think it was, that they sold to this person. And this company that sold paper had somehow had the ability to get a Model X generator. And these were scarce and people wanted them. And so this paper company that had access to the Model X generator was making a deal with their existing customer. And the question you needed to resolve was, are these people merchants? Is this paper company a merchant? Well, obviously the paper company is a merchant because they buy and sell paper and stuff. But they're not a merchant in Model X generators because they don't deal in goods of the kind. It was important that you distinguished that. That's what that part of the exam was about. So one way to be a merchant is to be one who deals in goods of the kind. A second way to be a merchant is where by your occupation you claim to have knowledge that is peculiar to either the goods or the type of transaction. Now, a person, for example, who is a carpenter, or better yet, a furniture maker. Here's his occupation. They have a business where they make furniture. They have special knowledge about the goods. Lawyers typically have special knowledge about the type of transaction. However, please keep in mind that when you have, by your occupation, not hobby or anything else, you claim to have special knowledge of goods of the kind, that you will be treated as a merchant only if you're acting in your mercantile capacity. so that a lawyer who goes to the corner store to buy a can of tomatoes is not acting in his or her mercantile capacity. But a lawyer who is advising someone in, in some business transaction could very well be treated as being in a mercantile capacity. So by your occupation, you claim to have knowledge peculiar to the type of goods involved or the type of transaction. A person who, well, you understand this. A person who is, let's talk about this for a second. Let's suppose you have a car and you want to sell your car. And I'm a mechanic by day. And you want to sell your private car to me, and I come by your house after working hours to buy your car. Well, I am a person who, by my occupation, claims to have specialized knowledge about cars. And so by that token, I should be treated as a merchant. On the other hand, am I really acting in my mercantile capacity when I buy a car for my own personal use? Now, at my garage, if I buy a transmission to go into a car that I'm repairing, I'm certainly acting in my mercantile capacity. Okay? But if I'm buying a car for my personal use, is that acting in my mercantile capacity? I don't actually know. I haven't found any cases on that. I would just argue both ways. I don't think so, though. There's a comment, one of the comments in the UCC at 2-104 points out that bankers and lawyers are not treated as merchants when they are not acting in their mercantile capacity, and what they were inferring is things like buying things at the grocery store, being a consumer instead of acting in your mercantile capacity. So I think when these people are acting as consumers, they are not treated as merchants, and so the mechanic, if I come to your house to buy your car after working hours, and I'm a mechanic by day, am I acting in my mercantile capacity? I don't really know, but you can see the arguments on both sides. Thirdly, one who hires an intermediary who by that person's occupation they claim to have knowledge peculiar to the goods or type of transaction. Typically, what happens now is you have a university, and the university has a purchasing department, of course. And the people in the purchasing department claim to have specialized knowledge about, you know, the stuff that they're buying or about the type of transaction. And so a university would be treated as a merchant because they have hired people, namely the people in their purchasing department, who have specialized knowledge about the type of transaction, and therefore the university would be treated as a merchant. It also means that General Motors, who is, let's say they buy a lot of paint from someone. And as I mentioned, just buying paint doesn't make you one who deals in goods of the kind. But if you buy a lot of paint, isn't it true that General Motors has got a purchasing department? They can claim specialized knowledge about paint, about the transaction. And General Motors probably has hired a paint expert, somebody who works for them that, you know, is an expert in paint by his or her occupation. And so General Motors would be treated as a merchant in paint in the example I was talking about because of this third way. So the three ways, in summary, that you can become a merchant is to be one who deals in goods of the kind, or by your occupation claim to have knowledge peculiar to these goods, and you're acting in your mercantile capacity. And there's some uncertainty about exactly what that means, but it doesn't matter. On examination, just make arguments on both sides. And then one who hires an intermediary will be treated as a merchant if the intermediary has knowledge peculiar to the goods or the type of transaction. So that's how the Uniform Commercial Code defines a merchant, and here are the code sections which are tested. 2-201 subsection 2 is the merchant's written confirmation. This merchant's written confirmation is a confirmation where I am a merchant and you and I both are merchants. And we've made a deal on the telephone. I'm going to buy 1,000 shirts from you, and you say, no problem, you send them right over. Okay. Now I send you a written confirmation saying this is to confirm our telephone call that I'm buying 1,000 shirts from you at $5 a piece or whatever they were. And I send that to you. that is a written confirmation from me to you. Now, what this code section says is that if I send that written confirmation, we're both merchants. First of all, we have to both be merchants for this to work. And that's why we're talking about this, because this is one of those sections where the bar examiners very commonly make one of us an obvious merchant, and the other one, you got to work at it to prove that they're merchant using these rules. So here's the situation. If I send you a written confirmation of this telephone transaction, and what I send you is enough to bind me, and you actually receive it, none of this lost in the mail stuff, and you have reason to know of the contents of the email, letter, or whatever it is you got from me, you don't really have to read it, and you do not object within 10 days of the date that you got it, telling me, nope, that what I wrote to you is not acceptable or not satisfactory, or some objection. If you don't object within 10 days, then you will be treated just as though you signed also. So the statute of frauds is satisfied as to both you and me. But this only works between merchants, and that's why one of these code sections here, that's why this is one of the code sections where it works if it's between merchants, and you need to know who is and who is not a merchant in a number of situations. There was a case on the bar where a university was buying some air quality monitoring equipment to do some monitoring out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And they were going to buy this equipment and use it for the purpose that I mentioned, it's a research purpose. And after the president of the company and someone at the university had made an oral transaction, one of them sent the other one a written confirmation of their transaction. Now, are they both merchants? Because the other person who received the written confirmation never did sign anything. And the rest of the problem, you had to decide whether or not that person was liable. But they didn't sign anything. And so is this really a transaction between merchants when one of them sells air quality monitoring equipment and the other one is a university? And so you had to know what we were talking about here. You use this method to show that the university would be treated as a merchant because their entire purchasing department is a bunch of people who, by their occupation, claim to have specialized knowledge about the type of transaction. And not only that, the goods themselves, the air monitoring equipment, probably the professor that's going to use this stuff is also an expert in how that equipment works and so forth. So the university would be treated as a merchant, but you had to deal with that in this problem. Another section where the rule applies only if the transaction is between merchants is 2-207. Now there's a whole lecture on 2-207, but as you know, it deals with an acceptance with a proposal for some addition or different part to the contract. So I send you an offer, and you send back and you say, you accept, but you propose some different change. Now, I'm not talking about the case where you say, you accept only if I agree to something else. That's a rejection counteroffer. But you accept my offer to sell you my car, but you propose that I deliver it to you. Normally, you come and get it at my place. You want to buy something from Sears, you go to Sears and get it. You want to buy my car, you come here and get it, unless we make other arrangements. So you say, you accept, but you propose that I deliver it to you. So that's an acceptance with a proposal for some addition to the contract. What happens to that addition, that proposed addition, depends on whether we are both merchants or not. If we are both merchants, you know the rule. If we are both merchants, that proposal automatically becomes a part of the contract unless one of three things: either I told you in the offer, don't propose anything to me, or you didn't object to the proposal for a reasonable amount of time, not 10 days, but a reasonable amount. You didn't object, or I didn't. You said to me that you proposed that I deliver it, and so if I didn't object to that within a reasonable amount of time, and or if the proposal materially alters the contract. So unless one of those things is true, the proposal will automatically become a part of the contract only if and only if we are both merchants. So this is one of those sections where both parties need to be merchants. What the bar examiners typically do to you here is they make one of them obviously a merchant, and the other one is the problem, is whether or not the person is really a merchant. There was a problem in the bar exam where a person was a builder of power plants, industrial power plants is what this person built. And this person wanted to buy a turbine. And they sent the specifications for this unique turbine for this power plant that they were building. And the company that bid on building the turbine, they were obviously merchants because they build and sell turbines. But what about the person who builds power plants? Was that person a merchant? Well, that person doesn't deal in goods of the kind. They just buy turbines and install them. By their occupation, they claim to have knowledge, peculiar to the goods at least, because they send out the specs. And so that person, the builder of the industrial plants, would be treated as a merchant. This was, you needed to know that to deal with the rest of the problem. In both of these cases, 2-201 subsection 2 and 207, these sections apply if the transaction is between merchants. These, between merchants. Here, you don't need two merchants, you just need the transaction. You need the implied warranties at 2-314 by a merchant. So if you're selling goods, as you know, there are implied warranties that the goods are fit for ordinary use, that they're adequately labeled, that they're adequate warnings, adequate instructions, how to use them, all that, those implied warranties in 2-314. There's a whole lecture on that in products liability. And, but those warranties are implied to the seller if the seller is a merchant. And finally, at 2-205, the firm offer, a merchant can make a firm offer. It's almost like an option. A merchant makes a firm offer to someone, and they promise, I will not revoke this for a reasonable time up to not more than 3 months. But to make a firm offer so you can't revoke your firm offer, you need to be a merchant. So this is by a merchant. So these two are by merchant, and these two are between merchants. These two are tested frequently. This is tested on the multiple choice part, not seen it tested on the essay part. And this you need to know for products liability. Now, the other 8 sections of the UCC that refer to merchants that have never been tested on the California bar exam are these. 2-103, the definition of good faith. Merchants, if the parties are merchants, good faith means honesty in fact, reasonable commercial transactions. In these 2 sections, these are cases where a person is retaining goods that belong to someone else, and there's some special rules about when merchants are doing it. Here, if a merchant has rejected some goods and you want to send them back to the person who's selling them to you, you got to follow the seller's instructions. That's what these are about. This stuff has never been tested. 2-509, a risk of loss. If we're not in those cases where you have a transaction and you're selling and it's FOB or it's CIF or any of those kinds of things. There are special rules about who bears a risk of loss. But the one where it matters here, being a merchant, is here under this risk of loss. If you don't have all of that stuff, like if you and I have a contract and I'm supposed to, and you tell me to deliver the goods to a certain boat, but when I hand the goods over to that boat, the risk of loss is on you from then on. Or if you tell me to deliver them to a particular place, and if I deliver them to that particular place, the risk of loss is on you when they are tendered in such a way that you can pick them up whenever you want, or they're there, you can have them. Here at 2-509, if I'm delivering the goods directly to you, not through some shipper, if I'm delivering the goods directly to you, if you are a merchant, then if I'm a merchant, the goods are the risk of loss passes upon receipt, and if you are a non-merchant, the risk of loss passes when you tender the goods. But this stuff is never tested, never has been tested. In 2-209, a non-merchant needs to sign or initial the integration clause when you're buying a used car and buying it on time, and there's a provision in there that says this contract is in writing and it's integrated, and no salesperson or anyone else, nothing they say can contradict what's in the writing, and you can't change it except by writing, all that stuff. Well, a lot of states and the UCC has a provision that says when you have that kind of stuff in your sales contract, that the customer has to initial that or sign that part separately to be sure it's brought to their attention. And that's what 2-209 says, but that's never been tested either. So none of these have ever been tested, nor do I expect them to be tested. The ones that really are tested are these four here, and you understand in those cases the definition of how you might be a merchant, one who deals in goods of the kind, or one who by his or her occupation claims specialized knowledge, like that builder of industrial plants claims specialized knowledge of the type of goods because he sent out the specifications, or one who hires an intermediary who by that person's occupation claims knowledge peculiar to the goods or the type of transaction, and therefore most institutions that have purchasing departments or experts who work there will become merchants under those rules. Those are the three ways to be a merchant. Don't forget that an individual needs to be functioning in his or her mercantile capacity in order to be treated as a merchant. And finally, here are the four code sections which are actually tested on the bar, and you should be sure that you're familiar with those. And that is the end of this lecture on who is a merchant.